Welcome back to our special panel discussion, Nigeria at 57, the Pulse of a Nation. Still with us are Vincent Anigbogu, the Director General at the Institute for National Transformation, and Austin Tam-George, a former Commissioner of Information in Rivers State. Gentlemen, thank you so much for staying with us on the show today. Now, of course, talking about inclusive growth. Now, this call for inclusive growth, many say, is the factor responsible for this louder call for restructuring in Nigeria today. Tam, I'm going to begin with you. What do you make of this new wave across Nigeria, the call for restructuring?
Yeah, well, the call for restructuring is happening, I suppose, because people are no longer satisfied. They can no longer accept what they consider to be the over-centralization of state power. We are running, theoretically speaking, a federal state. And the very notion of federalism means that the constituent units that make up the federation will have a certain measure of control over affairs that directly impact people who live in those localities. But in Nigeria, we have had, in practice, an over-centralization of state power to the point where there seems to be a loss of recognition of the kind of impact that needs to be made across the states. And so what people are calling for is this kind of decentralization so that, there will be more powers given to the states. But only that is not where the problem lies, I think. I think that while the call for restructuring is good, because in any case it is consistent with the principles of federalism, I'm worried that there is no corresponding clamor for good governance, because it seems to me as though people are assuming that the more they have power, the better the material conditions of our people will be. That is not true. That is not the case. I think that what we should be seeing is the call for restructuring, the call for decentralization of power, all right, but then we ought to have a corresponding call for good governance at all levels of government. Why I say this is because people want more powers in the states. They want more powers, but I'm not hearing sufficient emphasis on good governance in the states. What we are seeing, I'm sorry to say, is that there is a privatization of the state at all levels of government. What I mean by that is that whether the states have more power or not, how can they make sure that the powers they have also have responsibilities and that they are actually acting out their responsibilities to the people? For instance, how can we be sure that in those places where they are calling for more powers to be given to the states, how can we make sure that the governors are acting more responsibly? How can we make sure that the governors themselves are willing to devolve more powers to the local government areas where more and more of our people are residents? So I see this call for restructuring as very disturbing in the sense that the quality of the debate is very low. How can we make sure that there is also a corresponding structure of accountability to whom much is given, much accountability ought to be expected?
Vincent, if I understand what Tam-George is saying, I guess he's even calling more of restructuring for in our institutions, institutions that serve as checks and balances. So even if we practice what we call in quotes, like to say here, true federalism, the fact that these institutions do not function as they should, doesn't really, leaves us where we are at the very beginning. What do you make of this, Vincent?
Absolutely. To build a nation, as I said, you need a team, a competent team. You need strong institutions, especially the regulatory institutions. Even the military and the paramilitary institutions that you need to establish security, you need them. So training is critical. Being that that's my passion, we've had the opportunity to train across the different stratas of leadership, from federal to state. And I am shocked of the dearth of skills, knowledge, and even the proper leadership attitude. There's a proper leadership attitude that will bring about the desired result. And I see this increasing personal ownership of leadership, especially even at the state level. But I'm glad that I can say that we are beginning to see governors that really understand the importance of quality leadership across the board. And I know some that have invested heavily to make sure the commissioners and everybody is trained properly on strategic planning. Those things are lacking. Simple strategic planning. What do you do in your ministry, whether at the federal or the state level? Knowing the critical issues that you need to address, breaking them into goals and action plans, and know how to. Those things are not. I was quite shocked. In many places, they don't exist. We just finished training some commissioners in a particular state. And one of them said to me, said, "Prof, thank you for coming." Said, "Before you came, all I was doing was just moving files from keeping view, what have you. But now I realize that what I have actually is an enormous responsibility that goes beyond moving files." So I just say that to say that human capital development is going to be critical. If you just devolve power to the state, but they don't have the skills, they don't have the knowledge or the proper leadership attitude, we are back to square one.
Tam, do you think people really understand this restructuring we're talking about? I mean, there are two things happening now, two conversations we're having in the country, those calling for restructuring and those calling for a division. I mean, I can tell you that there are people who actually think restructuring means just going our separate ways. Is there really a proper understanding of what they're really asking for, of what restructuring is about, and what, of course, even the division they're asking for is about?
No, as I understand it, restructuring means, remaining within the country, but changing the internal architecture of the state to make sure that, look, power moves from one place to the other.
No, clearly you understand that.
Yes.
But of course, the larger populace here is my question. Do they really understand what the conversation goes? Because he mentioned, I mean, one thing is to understand what is really going on, to understand what is before you, the implications.
Yes, and that was why I mentioned the point that it's not enough simply to hunger, to ask for more power. But we need to understand that those who have more power have more responsibilities. Yes. I have worked, as I said, at a cabinet position in a state government, and I've seen very closely, at close quarters, how state power is used, how it is deployed. If it is deployed positively, there is a large amount of good that can be done by government. But if it is otherwise, what we will find is an increasing, privatization of the state, by which I mean the resources of state simply hijacked by individuals in government and simply used for private purposes. So in that situation, no matter how much of structural reforms that happen, you won't have any changes in the material conditions of the people, because there is a privatization, there is an ownership of the state's resources by individuals. So what we should be looking for is, yes, how can we decentralize power so that we make the center less and less attractive, so that politics at the center or going towards the center is not constituted as warfare, where people fight desperately because once they get to the center, they know they amass a great deal of power. If we decentralize to the point where the center becomes less and less attractive, it means that the new focus of battle will have to be in the states where power has been devolved. My own understanding, both theoretically speaking and my own experience, in public service, is that to whom much power is given, much responsibility has to be expected. And my concern is that while we are getting more and more vociferous calls for restructuring, we are not getting as much priority discussion on how we can effect good governance. Because let me give you an example. I am from the Niger Delta area, and restructuring, I suppose, for people in my region would mean a certain measure of control over local resources, right? And that would not be a radical demand. I mean, it will be consistent with federalism. I lived for over a decade in South Africa. If you wanted to mine for platinum in South Africa, you wouldn't go to Pretoria for license. You go to the King of Mafeking in the Northwest, okay, who then gives you a mining lease, and then you pay resource tax to Pretoria. So that's a federal system. So if people in the Niger Delta, for instance, want a certain measure of control over resources found in their areas, that's not a radical demand. It's in fact consistent with federalism. But the point then is that even if you control 100% of the resources, If there is no corresponding structure of accountability, material conditions will not change.
Kelly, you've made that point. Let me come to Vincent. He just mentioned something key. Of course, restructuring has different definitions to different people. It depends on what part of the country you're from. In the East, I'm sure restructuring actually means going our separate ways. I mean, we all know the call from IPOB at the moment that's actually gaining momentum by the day. Let's take a look at the situation in the East at the moment. I mean, that is the most critical right now, of course, with the federal government sending in military into that particular space. What do you make of the development in the East? And do you think the government is handling it the right way?
You know, one of the questions you asked earlier is how Nigeria can achieve inclusive growth.
Yes.
And inclusive growth requires fair and even-handed policy. Policy that does not discriminate. Okay. The federal government has made a major mistake. When they accepted the fact that they would distribute resources and appointments according to the voting pattern. Okay, let's look at what happened recently. NNPC appointment. Okay? None went to the Southeast. None. I mean, how many went to the South? Maybe 3. You send the wrong message. And I've learned that hate begets hate. Love begets love. And as we said before, once you tell people that they're excluded, it's going to be hard to sell them and convince them they are part of you. So by subscribing to that policy, the government, whether intentionally or unintentionally, sent the wrong message. And of course, it is these young men whose future is in question are most affected. Those of us who are already in our advanced age, you know, we can patiently wait, but they can't. So in that regard, that policy, I believe it's not a policy that will make for. That's why my prayer is that our national leaders must be sensitive enough to know the impact of even the subtlest decisions they make on the life of their people. That's number one. So when they feel alienated, who do they run to? Unfortunately, they have this young man that seems to be articulating their frustration, even though they are not, it's not clear the direction. But, you know, unfortunately, they have listened to him. And I will blame the elite in the Southeast, because they should have stepped in, give proper direction to that unsettling. Are you with me?
Yes.
And properly moderate it. That's what I would say there. However, I don't think a great number of people in the Southeast actually are opting for a different separation from the country.
Yeah, but then you have a good number of youths actually hitting the street. My question is, do you think this is what many have described as misguided agitation? There are those who say, you know, how about taking this agitation to the doorstep of your leaders over the years? Yes, you know, allocation over the years did drop from the very beginning, from 1946 to where we are now. I mean, there's a point, it was actually about 1.3% back to 3%, then 13%, you know. So the thing is, do you think they're asking the right questions? Let's assume the East gets what they want, you know, and they become a country of their own. Does that guarantee, like you mentioned earlier, the fact, does that really guarantee accountability from their leaders? Monies are given to the governors to take care of the states to begin with. What are those monies used for? Because I want to believe that if there's some kind of, you know, development in the state, if you attract investment that creates jobs for these youths we see in these videos, you know, on television, I do not think the call for separation will come up. Who knows? I might be wrong. I mean, Tam, what do you think? You
know, I lived in Barcelona in Spain for some time in 2001, and I had friends from Catalonia. As you know, Catalonia has always wanted to be separate country from Spain. And, you know, they contribute about, you know, 30% of the distributable pool, you know, to the French economy. And yet they simply want to be on their own. you know, the sense of acute alienation that our people feel in certain regions of this country, they don't even have that kind of thing in Catalonia in Spain. And yet there is this separatist agitation that we've seen up to 2 days ago when they were, you know, wanting to conduct a referendum. We also have seen those kind of things among the Kurds in Iraq. We've seen those kind of things among the, those in Quebec, in Canada. So separatist agitations always arise from this sense of exclusionary politics I spoke about. But you mentioned something, Oyin, that is very important about how come they are not linking up with their leaders. You see, it depends on what you call, what they understand by leadership. My sense, observing the separatist agitations that we are seeing in the Southeast, is that even those leaders, those so-called leaders who occupy structures of power in the current political dispensation, are in some fundamental sense delinked from these common people themselves. And so while you may see them as leaders, the people you know, on the ground do not necessarily have access to them. And so what you have seen the individual Nnamdi Kanu has done is to create a differentiated habitat of power where they can have direct access to someone who is able to then articulate these frustrations. Does it always lead to something good? Not often. More often than not, it leads to this kind of demagoguery where a leader just emerges and then, you know, taps into this kind of populist sentiment. I believe that it is possible to have equal citizenship, fight for egalitarianism, make sure that we have free enterprise, and that people can find a way to actualize their dreams anywhere in this country while remaining within the four walls of this country. It's not an easy task. You know, the task of nationhood may sometimes outlast us. Some of us who are talking here, we may not see the kind of ideal Nigeria that we are discussing. But I told you about my own experience in South Africa. The ideal South Africa that Mandela spoke about in the 60s, a lot of people dismissed him as an idealist who you know, rather than pick up arms, you know, simply was talking about a non-racial, non-sexist South Africa. But eventually, that's the kind of South Africa that they have now. I could get those kind of benefits even if I was not, you know, a citizen of the country. So the point I'm making, therefore, is that it starts with idealism. Yes. We need to be able to envision the kind of society that we want. And this visioning process ought to be reflected in the actual state policies. This question of, with the kind of administrative actions that I take, will reflect 95% of those, favor for 95% of those who voted for me. And then those who didn't vote for me, the 5% who didn't vote for me, will have to bear the consequences of not making the proper choice. The moment you cast administrative behavior in this kind of percentage terms, you're already sowing the seed of exclusionary politics, and people are going to react. That is what we are seeing.
I agree with you there, Tam, because I mean, at the moment, you have that call for separation almost from every angle in the country. You have, of course, the South-South. Right now, there is relative peace in the Niger Delta, and we have seen, of course, that reflect in the income we're getting from oil, hoping that, you know, the militants don't come up again with another demand. I mean, how to resolve the issue of the Niger Delta is another talk entirely. Yeah. Then we have the IPOB now come up talking about the fact that we need to go our separate ways. Then you have Boko Haram in the north as well. Yes. You know, to begin with. I was reading an article today that said, you see, everyone keeps talking about the fact that we're marginalized. The poor talk about the fact that they're marginalized. And the person asked a question. He said, isn't the whole country marginalized as a result of bad governance to begin with? What do you make of this, really? I mean, it's not just coming from one part of the country. It's not a South-South, South-East discussion anymore. It's a South-South, South-East, North, name it. I mean, everyone is asking for something.
I think what you're seeing in the nation is a cumulative effect of negligent leadership. Leadership that lacked foresight. Leadership that didn't anticipate the growth of the nation. Yeah. Because and I use this with all due respect, any reasonable leader should understand that you don't lead from today, you lead with the future in mind. Your goal is to envision where a nation should be. Yeah. You know, I've had this statement made. Statesmen, you know, lead from the perspective of the next generation. politicians live for the next election. I'm sorry to say that we have politicians that are only thinking about the next election. Some are beginning to think transgenerationally. And it has been said by a sociologist that any nation is one generation away from anarchy. He says when you cannot redirect the energies of your young people between the age of 15 and 25, if you cannot anticipate their needs and provide it in advance, he says, so that that energy is channeled towards a national vision. He says, when you miss that, they're still going to use that energy, but in a destructive way. We have not had leaders that deliberately harness the energies of our youth.
Clearly, we're coming back to where we started, and that's what leadership.
We use them for talks to win elections, after which we dump them. That cannot continue.
Tam, I mean, 57 years. What is the way forward? How do we ensure we're not having this conversation 5 years after? How do we ensure that in the next 5 years we do not have empty streets when it's a day to to remember or mark our independence to begin with?
We need to make sure we need to inaugurate deliberate policies that will include everyone. Every Nigerian ought to feel that they are stakeholders, within the country. We need to be able to make sure that when we want a better country, it is not because we want to wish for it.
But
we want to work. How to do it is to make sure everyone feels, we've talked about appointments. How many South people are in this government? How many Southeast? Look, I understand that sentiment, but I have a slightly different perspective. I don't believe that representation and inclusiveness is necessarily as simplistic as simply making appointments. Because after all, you could appoint a bunch of incompetent people, from all regions, and yet, the benefits of governance doesn't, go down to people in the grassroots. So I don't define inclusiveness and growth in terms of how many people are representing different regions in this government. Yeah, sorry?
What is your definition?
My definition is to make sure that whenever we are involved in governance processes, the material conditions of our people, wherever they live, whether they live in Borno State, whether they live in Calabar, whether they live in Osun, must change. And once it changes, this kind of nationhood that we are all looking for, everybody will fight for it because we believe that everybody is a stakeholder. We've seen a situation where more and more people feel like they are economic refugees in their own country. We have very young people who are willing to work, who are entitled to get work, but they are simply economically excluded from their own economy. And so such people are willing to work, but they can't find work. They don't feel that they are stakeholders in such a system. And therefore, to make sure that we get the kind of country we are looking for, we need to make sure that whenever we are talking about GDP growth, we must make sure that there is job creation. Young people are finding jobs. They'll be able to buy homes. They'll be able to start families. They'll be able, those who are willing to start, businesses, ought to be able to get incentives. One thing that I think we should do, which we often don't do, is that we talk a lot about how we want to move the economy away from oil and gas, because we can see clearly from commodity prices that there's no future as far as these commodities are concerned. How then can we make sure we create a knowledge economy? How can we, for instance, make sure we invest in ICT? ICT is the oil of the future, but are we investing in that sector? Clearly we are not.
Let me bring Vincent in here. I keep asking, how do we do this? We know what we need to do. We know how to go about it, right? But the thing is, I'm asking myself now, do we really know how to go about it? Now, the outcome from Confab that happened under the former President Jonathan, that is yet to be deliberated upon and even discussed or agreed. My point is, how do you get the government to listen? How do you get the government to understand that it's time to effect changes in these areas we've talked about, from leadership to governance to ensuring inclusive growth as well, and also managing agitations better? How do you get the government to listen and change in a nutshell?
I'm going to make 7 points. But before I start, I think...
Can we make the 7 points in 2 minutes?
Yes,
okay,
I will. Number one, it all starts with sincere leadership. leadership that does not come to the table with a pre-agenda, but with a sincere heart to find a solution for common good. We need that. Number two, I believe that decentralization of power is critical. We need to devolve power to the states. Why is that important? So that each state will take ownership of their own destiny. And then they will have to find their competitive advantage. Whatever you need to develop. You see, if you study nations like Singapore, Israel, who have grown under very harsh conditions, you find that hardship is actually an environment for innovation, for creativity. Number three, we need to, once a state takes ownership and decides what to develop, then they will take human resource, capital development serious. The education pattern becomes tailored towards the need. So that would even affect education. And number four, it makes them, once the industries and development begins to emerge in the state, they begin to produce goods and services, which creates employment. And not only that, it creates regional market. They begin to export. Their GDP will grow. And if you ask me, that formula is a win-win for everybody.
Okay.
That's the last point I want to make.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much for your time today, gentlemen. You know, really interesting conversation we've had here, especially as Nigeria marks 57 years. We're hoping that when we're having this conversation again, say another 5 years, it's going to be a completely different story. I want to keep my fingers crossed on that. Of course, that's what we have time for on the CNBC Africa Special Panel discussion. Many thanks to my guest host, Vincent Anigbogu, the Director General at the Institute for National Transformation, and Austin Tam-George, the former Commissioner of Information in Rivers State. I'm Onyi Sunday. Happy Independence Day, Nigeria. The 1st of October is a day set aside to celebrate Nigeria's independence from the United Kingdom. And when the West African country achieved this milestone, there was jubilation within its borders. But since then, much has changed. The country's 57-year history has featured 3 years of civil war, 29 years of dictatorship by the military, and 28 years of democratic rule. A complicated past. Well, this year, with Nigeria's unity under the spotlight, we bring you Nigeria at 57. The pulse of a nation, a lively panel discussion about the best way for the country to craft a path towards a bright future. Welcome, I'm Onyi Sunday. And my panelists today are Vincent Anigbogu, the Director General at the Institute for National Transformation, and Austin Tam-George, a former Commissioner of Information in Rivers State. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting
Thank you so much.
Of course, Independence Day. Not sure how excited most Nigerians are these days towards independence. I mean, we should see the green, white, green flags everywhere. It's been a bit of a quiet celebration of the past few years. What do you say? Right?
I think so. You know, it's funny, growing up in the 60s, this was an event we all look forward to. Dress up in white and white, carrying our flags, and we line up the road as our government officials and joyfully wave our flag, you know. But unfortunately, we have not been able to chart a clear direction, a vision that everybody can connect to, that gives a sense of hope. I think that's what's missing.
Tam-George, do you think that's the reason why we don't see, you know, people wear the white and white and line up the streets waving their flags at government officials? Is it a case of the fact that the government hasn't given us enough to celebrate, or what is it really? Or we're just lacking the white and white materials these days?
Well, you know, there's always what you could call the trauma of nationhood. There are problems that people face in every country. No country in the world is perfect. In fact, even in the United States, where people tend to line up in every embassy for visas, they also have very serious problems with crime and identity politics. Here in Nigeria, I suspect that we'll get it right as soon as we're able to, as Vincent has said, find common values that can collectivize us as Nigerians. We haven't found that sense of nationhood yet. We are a country because we have the administrative units, we have a common border, so the physicality of being a country separate from other countries is there. But what we need to do is to find out if we could generate the kind of values of nationhood. Such values include, equal citizenship, egalitarianism, equal opportunity, free enterprise, the tendency that if you leave River State and work somewhere in Borno, or if you leave Borno and go to somewhere in Bauchi, you ought to be able to feel as an equal citizen, wherever you are. So we haven't yet found that rhythm of citizenship, and that is why I suspect we still have that trauma of nationhood.
Now, Vincent, just taking something, Tam mentioned, said we haven't found a sense of nationhood. Could this be because nationhood was forced upon the entity called Nigeria to begin with? There are actually those who say Nigeria wasn't meant to be a country in the first place. There are those who say what we're practicing right now is pretty alien to us, and that is why 57 years down the line, we're still having these issues. What do you think, Vincent?
I think, just to dovetail on what he said, nation building is a journey. First of all, I think I would rather be a free man in my grave than to be a slave to anyone. So independence is an inevitable destination for us. Let me say this with all humility. There's a difference between liberating fathers and founding fathers. I'll give you 2 examples. Liberating fathers fight hard to liberate their nations from so-called oppressors, but they have no clear chart the direction the nation will go. The founding fathers, like in Singapore, not only fought to liberate their nations from Britain, for example, but they worked very hard to lay a solid foundation that within one generation, they took their nation from third world to first world. Why? Because step by step, they understand that nation building is a science. It's not something you pull out of a black bag. You must know what you're doing. You must know the critical factors. You must know the systems that must be in place. And I was meditating on that. 57 years, what has gone wrong? If you look at how we select our leaders, we don't select leaders based on their knowledge of nation building. We select them because they are our own people, they speak eloquently, they are charismatic. We hardly choose them based on the fundamental principles that make for nation building. And so we keep missing the point.
But don't you think that's because this was the way we've always gone from the very beginning? I mean, let's look at those who sat in those chairs from the very beginning. We got so concerned with the tribe our president would come from. Yes. We got so interested in who was going to be represented at the helm of affairs better, rather than what they're really bringing to the table. I mean, isn't that what's really playing out 57 years after Tam?
No, that's correct. I mean, identitarian politics will always be our undoing. This country can only advance as far as our primordial instincts allow us. If we are able to choose our leaders, as Vincent has said, according to the protocols of excellence, according to the needs of building a modern state, you will find that once we use those kind of scientific, verifiable criteria, we will find some of the best Nigerians wherever they are, including in the diaspora. But when we use anthropological concerns, primordial concerns such as where you come from, what kind of God you worship, what's your ethnic identity, it means we will lower and lower the standards. And I think that the country will reflect such low standards. So what we've seen so far over the past 57 years is that we've not been able to overcome those kind of primordial pools, you know, that make us always go for mediocres instead of those who have manifest, you know, abilities to administer the country. You raised one fundamental point concerning whether Nigeria is a forced nation upon us. I think that there has been so much discussion about how Nigeria is first of all an artificial creation. My own understanding of how nations are formed across the world is that all nations on earth are artificial creations. You see, sometimes people also say, Nigeria is only a mere geographical expression. No definition of nationhood can ignore the physicality of it. So none of these things are fundamentally a problem. Yeah. What matters is what do you do with it? You know, I don't know if you grew up in the 80s, there was one song, you know, by a group of musicians called "Now That You Found Love, what do you do with it?" Now we've been dealt this kind of country. What do we do with it? We've seen, as we discuss, you know, down the line, I will show examples because I have been in government and I've seen in very close quarters how administration functions in this country. If we have fundamental problems of administration, we can't continue to blame Lord Lugard for that. Yeah. If we are flying about in private jets while our people can't have water to drink, we can't blame Lord Lugard for that. Yeah. What we should do is, we've been dealt this country. How can we rethink it? How can we reformulate the terms of social engagement? How can we make sure we create, you know, a new state? That is our responsibility.
It's a good thing we're actually starting with the foundation. Back again to the issue of leadership. Now, if you see, of course, the way we've selected our leaders has been this way from the very beginning. It is said that one cannot learn to be left-handed in old age. 57 years after, what is the way to go? How do we turn this around? Because you see, I also believe, like most Nigerians, that if we do not tackle the issue around leadership, restructuring, which we're going to talk about on the show, and any other agitation coming after, you know, we'll just keep being mere protests if we do not deal with the foundational issues. How do we begin to turn this around 57 years after?
You know, we have so many models to copy from. What we are struggling with, many nations have gone through them and succeeded. So we have history to learn from. And I keep going back to Singapore. It's a fantastic model we can copy. Studies have shown to go from mediocrity to greatness, there are 7 critical steps. Number 1, you must have a leader whose passion goes beyond personal, but who is ready to offer themselves, if you will, as a sacrifice to build a nation, to build a people. Their thinking is beyond their tribal, religious. They have a holistic concept of leadership. To put it differently, they are fathers that are ready to carry a nation like a baby and nurture them appropriately at different stage of growth until they reach their maturity. We need leaders like that. Number 2, such a leader must have competent people around him, people that are not yes people, but people who can look at him or her in the eyes and question some of the policies and decisions. And out of that heated conversation comes a well-refined policies and programs that can impact their nation. Number 3, such a team must critically look at what's on ground and find out what I call competitive advantage, not comparative. Comparative is just a potential you have, but competitive advantage is what you are good at and you can deliver to the world. And we will talk more about that. What is Nigeria's competitive advantage? What do we have advantage over the rest of countries in Africa and the world? A good leader must help us find that so that we put our strength in that area. Number 4, we must also build a culture of discipline. The same study shows that to change a nation, you start with people of character. Character is number 1 factor in changing a nation. If you produce disciplined people who now have disciplined thinking, experts in their different areas, if you then place them properly, they will transform that sector. So if we follow that methodical system of choosing the right leader, aggregating the right team with the competence, focusing on what we really need to do, and not romanticizing with philosophies and, you know, but let's be pragmatic and find what happens. So if we do that,
let me bring you in. Let me bring you in here. You know, with the points that he has just mentioned. How realistic is that? Taking a look at the political system we have here in Nigeria. I mean, we all know that when it comes to politics, it's expensive in Nigeria to begin with. There are people who you need on your side to sponsor you through. So, you know, this whole talk about getting the leader with the right character, who is not really after his own personal interest, but the interest of the country he aims to govern. How do you achieve that with the kind of political system we run in the country?
I'm afraid that the level of social consciousness of our people will have to rise beyond where we are. I don't think that leaders who are very good, you know, at what they do will necessarily emerge, except they are chosen by an equally enlightened followership. So this kind of connection, this kind of relationship between those who lead and those who choose them has got to be recalibrated. We need to look at this very carefully. We've seen situations where we have the kind of fragility of institutions that ought to check and balance those who occupy the structures of power. We've seen that sometimes well-intentioned people go into public office, and yet because there are no institutions to check their excesses, they degenerate into mediocrity and sometimes even autocracy. So what we need to do is to raise the level of social consciousness for our people so that when they go to choose their leaders, they are not pulled, you know, by ethnicity and those kind of primordial concerns. They are more concerned about how can my material conditions change because of the choice I'm about to make. So we need to be able to do that. No, to do that, it's not going to happen in a moment of epiphany. It's got to happen when we invest in good education, civic education. I'm not talking about education in the sense that we typically understand it in this country, which is sometimes plagued by excessive emphasis on credentialism and certification. I'm more interested in how people can be aware that their poverty is not because of the wiles of Satan, but their poverty is a direct consequence, okay, of the mismanagement of the general commonwealth. And so if they can draw this correct and direct link between their material conditions and the quality of governance, then they will be sensitized enough to say, look, this time around, the choice has to be made wisely. And once they do that, they go, you know, to make the choice, but they don't fall back to sleep. As soon as those choices are made and the people have been inaugurated into office, citizens must activate civil society organizations to act as alternative structures of checks and balances so that we hold these individuals to account. What we've seen over the past 50 years, I'm sorry to say, is that we've almost ritualized elections to the point where we believe that democracy has become so reductionist that we think that democracy means only voting in every 4 years. But democracy means holding people to account. Democracy means periodically asking, constantly asking, why are students not learning well? Do we have the set of skills already articulated in our school curriculum to make sure that we envision a better society? How can we diversify our economy by simply talking about it in the soapbox? How can we make sure that the idea of diversifying the Nigerian economy away from the extractive economy has got to find some kind of reflection in our educational practices? These are not questions that you expect politicians to ask and answer. These are questions that have to be asked and answered by the citizens themselves.
So let me bring you in here. I mean, it's a good thing we're actually building this foundation. You know, for us to be able to smile, probably we are white and white in the next independence, is for us to deal with critical issues, find the right leadership, ensure we have the right leadership. And to achieve that, you've also made that point clear, Tam, education is needed. Excellent. People need to understand what is required of them and what is required of the government as well. Talking about, of course, you know, civil education, like you talked about, how much of that do we still see in our institutions today? I mean, as a child, I know we had what we called social studies in school, and we did learn. But then my generation is also in some form of leadership and is also not so perfect with that generation as well. So it's just really about, you know, what we get from our institutions, or is there much more, Vincent?
I think so. Actually, I'm a chemist by training. I have a PhD in chemistry. And I lived in America for 30 years, lecturing there, until I saw this void, this leadership void in our nation. I had the privilege to consult for top government agencies on technical areas, but I saw this void in leadership, competent leadership. So I actually moved back to Nigeria to start the Institute for National Transformation. Why? Because we are not taught properly. An average Nigerian leader doesn't understand leadership. The fact that I have a PhD in chemistry does not make me a leader. It makes me a technical expert. But that doesn't mean I can lead. Leadership is an art. It's a skill that must be deliberately acquired. So as I went into leadership, I find out how ignorant I am in terms of leading. And yet people look at my technical credentials and immediately ascribe leadership qualities to me. So what am I trying to say? The Nigerian elite, especially those that aspire for public office, must deliberately go and train and prepare themselves. Our academic systems do not produce leaders. They produce technical experts. And one of the things that make nations like America and the UK very unique is that they have very specialized leadership schools through which, if you're going to aspire for public office, it's already known that you must submit yourself to those institutions, to be mentored, to be grounded beyond your technical expertise. We lack that. And so we are electing people in office that don't have a clue what leadership is. Instead of leading us to greatness, they're actually, unfortunately, leading us backwards. I think we need to change the whole concept of education. But I'm glad that leadership schools are springing up. And I'm also glad that many are beginning to realize this, and they're submitting themselves to leadership discipleship abroad.
It's almost basically just coming back to the point, you know, we mentioned earlier, the way our political system runs to begin with. Money talks, you know, at the end of the day. Who's willing to take the party forward to ensure we get the votes is really what people are after, not really, you know, how much of leadership qualities that you have, as it were. You know, just moving forward now to what we have here today. Tam, what do you think is the biggest threat to Nigeria's unity today?
I think it's exclusionary politics. We've seen a situation where, you know, since independence, we've found people gain access into office, whether they were elected or whether they shot themselves through coup d'etat into office. Once they get into office, you know, we haven't seen policies in practical terms, you know, that collectivizes people. What we've seen is this kind of winner takes all, this kind of exclusionary politics. And you see, it's a game of one-upmanship. This community has to be better than the other community. This region has to be far ahead of, you know, the other region. We must try to erect an architecture of domination such that once we get into office, we use that office not to advance the common good, not to make sure that the country advances towards some kind of higher level, but to show that this region is in control. And so what we've seen is this kind of perennial dedication towards exclusionary politics, which means excluding people from getting involved in the governance process. Now, when you do that, you know, you reduce the sense of citizenship of others. And so they feel that they are not stakeholders. And you see, in practical terms, anybody who feels that they've been excluded from a system feels that that system ought to be destroyed. That system ought to be overcome. That system has to be undermined. And so you find that there are different tendencies towards separatism. We've seen lately, you know, that more and more people feel that they need to decenter themselves, they need to disconnect themselves from the notion of Nigerianness because they believe that that notion oppresses them. When they encounter the state, when they encounter political leadership, They encounter leadership as a predatory force, something that subjugates them. And so we need to find a way, you know, to build a nation where every person feels that he or she is a stakeholder, which was why in my introduction I said, anybody who is leaving one state, anybody who is moving from Abia State to Ebonyi, for instance, you'll feel that he's a Nigerian. Anybody who is leaving Kaduna and settling in Calabar ought to be able to feel that he's a Nigerian. He has access to property, he can live and set up his life there. We have the sense that that is not the case. And once that is not the case, there is this tendency to always withdraw from the common notion of Nigerianness. And once we have that kind of citizenship fatigue, the tendency is that people will feel that this system doesn't have much in store for me. I want to bring it down.
Vincent, exclusionary politics. Is that our biggest threat today?
I think so.
Okay.
If you don't get people to become involved, to have ownership, naturally they will feel alienated. I keep going back to Singapore. You know, we teach it in our institute. You know, it's one of my favorite case studies. How did a man take a nation from a third world condition that was worse than Nigeria, you know, and within one generation, it's now the third wealthiest nation in the world, has the highest number of millionaires without any natural resources. In fact, they have to import their water from Malaysia. How did he do that? He gave every citizen a stake in the nation. First of all, they developed a scheme where about 96% of Singaporeans have homes. What does that do? It creates ownership. Yeah. If you send them to war, they will go and fight. They are not going to fight to defend government. They are fighting to protect their home. Yeah. We need to do that. When you exclude people, then of course, naturally they will behave in such a way that they will not protect it. They will actually destroy it, as my colleague have said. And another thing, they've talked about what is the cost of a disunited Nigeria. Yeah. Number one, loss of our collective power. One of the reasons that the world economy is interested in Nigeria is our population. Anyway, you have a collection of 170 million people or more, people will be interested in you. If we break up, we will lose that incentive. We will lose that interest from the economic community. Number two, I don't know about you, I love the diversity in Nigeria. I love the fact that I'm from Anambra State. I love the fact that if I go to Middle Belt, I meet a different kind of culture. Are you with me? I enjoy that. If I come to the West, if I go to River, there's beauty in diversity.
Let me come in with this issue on population. Of course, that's one of the major factors that you have the international community attracted to Nigeria, and what we'll also lose if we are disunited. Yes, you know, we all understand the advantages of having this population that we have. But of what advantage is that population to the populace itself? That is my own question here. In as much as, you know, the fact that we're all together, money comes in, where's the money going to? Do the people themselves really partake of that advantage that you say that they carry collectively, Tam?
Population, you know, in practical marketing terms, can easily be understood as a market, yes. You know, because, you know, once you have a lot of people, you can convert that into a market in the sense that these are the people who have organic relationship with purchase. Yeah. These are the people who, you know, actually patronize. So people think of the populations always in terms of their purchasing strength. Sure. And so if you have a wide, a country with a wide population, it means you have an access to a wider distribution of goods and services. So in that sense, even smaller countries, as we've seen all over Europe, have come together, 27 of them. And in fact, 28 of them, you know, because of Brexit, now we are imagining, you know, in the next 2 or 3 years, yes, we are going to have 27 European countries bonding into the European Union. They have a common market. These are not just, you know, a chaotic aggregation of countries. This is a common market. They share a common defense policy. There's a mobility of citizenship. People are moving from that. And there's also an expanded sense of citizenship because you can live in the Netherlands and, you know, settle in the UK. You can go to Spain. You know, you can do all of these things, especially within countries that have geographical contiguity.
There's something to gain. From what you're saying, there is really
a lot to gain. But so, you see,
yeah.
in the context of Nigeria, I am not an advocate of looking at Nigeria only in the simplistic sense of a market. Yeah. We shouldn't remain together as Nigerians simply because we want to retain a common market. We should remain together because there's a rigorous commitment to equal citizenship. There is a rigorous commitment to egalitarianism. Anybody who is a Nigerian should feel that he has access to the fullest possible opportunities available to us. I schooled in South Africa. I did my PhD in South Africa, and I've said this in a different show. As a professional, I received some of my best possible opportunities in South Africa other than here in Nigeria, and I consider it sometimes as an embarrassment. I had all kinds of scholarships in South Africa. All the people who constituted the scholarship teams didn't care what my name was, they didn't care about my nationality. They had non-discriminatory standards, and I won 5 of them. When I left Johannesburg, I competed with thousands of applicants to be Andrew W. Mellon Fellow at the University of Cape Town. Applicants from Australia, from the Netherlands, from the UK. I was chosen among just 18. Nobody cared about where I came from. Now, to think that you can't have those kind of non-discriminatory standards in Nigeria, that is the ultimate scandal. And so I think that, yes, this tendency towards separatism is something that should concern us. But I don't think that we should remain in Nigeria simply because we want a large market. We should remain because we feel that once everybody has an opportunity, there's free enterprise, there is a commitment to egalitarianism, then we have a bigger space in which to actualize our citizenship.
All right, fantastic. I mean, after the break, we're going to be talking more about the new buzzword in the country today, restructuring. Of course, we're going to take a short break, and when we return, we're going to be talking more about achieving inclusive growth and making the most of the country's comparative advantage. Do stay with us.